everyone, Kristina Werner here. Welcome to another video for SIMONsTheStamp.com. Today I'm going to be showing you another card using a STAMPtember collaboration stamp set, this time from the Greeting Farm. So here's the stamp set from the Greeting Farm. It is called Winter is Here, and there are so many fun images that you can color or create backgrounds with on your cards. Today I'm not going to be doing some coloring. Instead, I'm going to be doing some ink blending. So I'm putting out my very stained mat here. This is an Easy Clean mat from Tonic, and I'm going to do ink blending with Distress Oxide inks. The first color I'm starting with is Cracked Pistachio, and I'm using a mini round blending tool, and I'm going to blend it up from one end of this cardstock. I'm using some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock in the 80-pound version, and I started with Cracked Pistachio, and now I'm bringing in Mermaid Lagoon. I'm going to try to blend these two colors as best that I can, and I'm actually going to kind of switch between the two colors so that I can get that blend even a little bit better. The thing that's interesting about blending with Distress Oxide inks is that they have a little bit of opacity to them. So if you kind of one color overtakes another one, you can always bring back that first color and kind of extend it out. Like right here, I'm bringing back in some Mermaid Lagoon because that blueprint sketch took it over a little bit. At the very end of the other color spectrum, I've got some black soot, and I'm bringing that in just to intensify that blueprint sketch. So now I've got a pretty good blend going from a nice green shade to blue to even darker bluish violet, and I really love how that turned out. I'm going to hit this with my heat tool to help speed up the drying time. For the most part, Distress Oxide inks dry fairly quickly, especially when compared to fully pigment inks. This is like a hybrid ink. But I'm going to do some heat embossing today, and I want to make sure that no embossing powder sticks to not dry ink. So I'm going to do a test run here. I'm going to do a couple test runs to see if my embossing powder is still going to stick to it. And I'm glad I tested it because it wasn't completely dry. So that embossing powder was still hanging on. So I was able to wipe it off with my fingertips really easily, dry it some more, and then test that cardstock one more time. And it seemed to work that time without any problems. So now I'm going to take that background and put it into my MISTI stamp positioning tool, using one of the creative corners to keep that in the same spot so that I can have stamps that go beyond the edge of the paper here on all sides. I'm arranging all of the images on my background in a very random fashion, and then I'm inking up the stamps with Versamark ink, and then I will press that down onto my background. Because there are so many images that are mounted all at the same time, I'm going to take my time and walk my fingertips over each one of these stamps. I want to make sure that each one gets the attention it deserves and gets transferred onto my background in a nice smooth design. So after I have that, I'm going to lift it up, and then I'm going to apply some white embossing powder. The embossing powder I'm using today is from Brutus Monroe. This is the Alabaster white color. And I love this stark white line on top of this blended background. And if your blending isn't perfect, like I had a couple little streaky spots, once you get going on this and add your images on top, it kind of distracts away from any not perfect blending, and it works great. If you have any areas of embossing powder that are kind of messy, you can use a dry brush just to brush that away. I then used my heat tool to heat set the embossing powder till it was smooth and melted, and it just intensified those bright lines. I then placed the stamps and moved them around a little bit and placed them to fill in those gaps, and then stamped it in the same ink once again. So this is Versamark ink. I like to use Versamark for heat embossing. That's usually the only time I use Versamark for the most part, and that's because it's a very sticky ink. It stays wet for quite a bit of time, so you don't have to rush when you're doing your heat embossing. So to fill in some of these gaps, I took the small heart in the stamp set, and I just stamped that using a block. For the small stamps like this that I'm going to be repeating, I like to just mount that on a block instead of using a MISTI for that. So I heat set those after applying some embossing powder, and the background is basically done at this point. I'm just going to work on the greeting for the card. So I'm taking the Winter is Here greeting from the stamp set, and I'm going to be embossing it onto some vellum cardstock. This vellum cardstock is from Basil, and I'm stamping the greeting image in Versamark ink. Now I did prep the vellum with an anti-static powder tool, and that's to help me get a really good impression. So you might be wondering, why didn't I use the powder tool on that blended background? Well, I noticed that the powder from the powder tool can sometimes leave streaks on distress oxide inks, especially over darker colors. It might be a little bit more visible. And even though you can wipe it off in the end, I still felt like you could see it a tiny bit. So in that case with distress oxide inks, I tend to not use the powder tool. So I cut out my greeting with a circle die, and I cut 2 of those to thicken up that vellum. Then I prepped my card base out of some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock, and I just scored that at 5.5 to create a top folding card. So in order to adhere these 2 vellum circles together, I'm taking some Ranger Multimedia Matte Adhesive and adding some small dots right behind the words. Then I'll press these 2 vellum circles together, and that just makes it so that the area around the words disguises the lines of the background underneath a little bit more. I found that having only 1 layer of vellum didn't provide enough contrast. It didn't block out the background enough so that the words were legible. So I adhered the background to the card base, and then I used some more of that adhesive and just put dots right behind the letters once again. And this is going to go directly onto the front of the card. I'm keeping this really simple. I considered adding twine, I considered adding sequins, things like that, but I decided I would keep this very simple and just have the greeting on top. And I did stack some acrylic blocks on top to give some weight and really adhere that vellum down to my card front. So that is the finished card for today. A really beautiful ink blended background with heat embossed images on top. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you in another Simon Says Stamp video very soon.